Hey guys, tonight we sink softly into the grey, candle-flickered gloom of Tudor England, where the smoke from burning heretics curls up into the wet, morning fog like the breath of ghosts. You're wandering the creaky halls of a stone palace, floorboards groaning under velvet-draped feet. Somewhere in the distance, bells toll low and ominous, warning the world that Queen Mary I is once again tightening her grip. You can almost smell the old ink of papal decrees, the bitter tinge of scorched wood, and the subtle sweetness of rosewater masking the scent of dread. This is not the England of fairy tales, it's the one where your prayers are watched. Your neighbors whisper, and you probably won't survive this if you pick the wrong side. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time you're tuning in. I always love seeing where you all are drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the rain-slicked cobbles of 1550s London, the sky hanging low and thick, as if holding its breath. The pubs murmur uneasily, and even the rats seem to scurry with more caution. The Queen Mary Tudor Bloody Mary, to her growing number of critics, sits upon England's throne. She's not the golden-haired child of promise her father once hoped for. No, Mary is weary-eyed, weighed down by a lifetime of betrayal, exile, and religious fury that now fuels the fire of her rule literally. Born to the infamous King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, Mary's childhood was a royal rollercoaster that dipped fast and hard. First declared legitimate, then bastardized when Henry cast Catherine aside for Anne Boleyn, Mary spent her early years dancing between princess and pawn. Historians still argue whether her father's cruelty or her mother's piety hardened her heart more. But by the time she ascended to the throne in 1553, she was already a woman with deep scars and a burning sense of divine purpose. You pass by a wooden scaffold outside St. Paul's, where a preacher once cried Protestant sermons but now stands in chains. The smoke still clings to the nearby stones. Mary's reign started with promises of mercy, but she wasted no turning mercy into martyrdom. Over the course of 5 years, she ordered the execution of nearly 300 religious dissenters, mostly Protestants by fire. That's right, she didn't just want them gone, she wanted them scorched into England's memory. And sure, it's easy to imagine a heartless tyrant here, but Mary didn't twirl her mustache and cackle. She believed, truly and fully, that heresy was a disease, one that needed burning away to purify the soul. For her, each pyre was an act of redemption. Try falling asleep to that twisted bedtime theology. You step into the echoing chapel of Westminster, where Mary often knelt, rigid and unmoving for hours. She was deeply religious, some would say fanatical, and saw herself as God's instrument to return England to Catholicism. One fringe theory even claims she wore an iron cross under her gown at all times, heavy enough to bruise her skin, as penance for the sins of her people. There's no proof of that, of course, but it fits the mood of her reign: guilt, gravity, and that constant pressure to cleanse. She didn't act alone, of course. Her advisers, especially the ruthless Bishop Gardiner and Cardinal Pole, were eager to light the kindling beneath England's reformers. But Mary was no puppet. She personally approved executions. One case, the burning of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, was delayed for weeks because she wanted him to publicly recant first. Then, in a move only a Tudor could dream up, she had him executed anyway. He dramatically shoved his hand, the one he'd used to sign his recantation, into the flames first. Bet they don't teach that in Sunday school. Still, not everything Mary did was bathed in blood. She tried to revive the currency, stabilize trade, and even re-establish ties with Rome. But her obsession with reversing her father's reformation left little room for anything else. And her personal life? Oh, a slow-motion train wreck. In 1554, she married Philip of Spain, heir to the most powerful empire in Europe, but the English hated him. They feared invasion, Catholic domination, and most of all, being absorbed into a Spanish empire where they'd be the forgotten cold, rainy cousin. You know, like every family's group chat has that one guy no one really replies to. Mary believed Philip loved her. He didn't. He showed up for the wedding, smiled politely, and then basically ghosted her Tudor style. She thought she was pregnant twice, maybe 3 times, even experiencing full-blown symptoms. But each time, her belly swelled with hope, and then quietly deflated. Historians still debate whether it was psychosomatic pregnancy, phantom symptoms, or perhaps a tumor. Whatever it was, it broke her a little more each time. You rest your hand on a cold, mossy stone wall of the Tower of London. Mary used it as a prison for enemies both real and imagined. Even her own sister Elizabeth, yes, that Elizabeth was locked inside. Mary suspected her of plotting rebellion, and well, she probably wasn't wrong. The court was a nest of vipers and whispered conspiracies, and Mary was always one betrayal away from total collapse. The irony is that Mary genuinely wanted to be loved. She saw herself as a mother to her people, but she mothered like a strict nun with a flaming sword. And when the fires finally died and Mary herself succumbed to illness in 1558, the crowds did not weep. They celebrated. That's harsh, but history doesn't always write eulogies with kindness. You glide eastward now, the damp chill of Tudor London melting into the perfumed dusk of ancient Chang'an, where incense coils lazily in the air, and the stone courtyards echo with the faint rustle of silk and schemes. You're walking through a palace of golden screens and jade corridors, where every smile is a test, every bow a performance. In the heart of this maze sits a woman cloaked in crimson, and Shadow Wu Zetian, the only woman in over 2,000 years of Chinese imperial history to rule as emperor in her own name. Not empress, not consort. Emperor of the year is 690, but time inside the Tang court feels timeless and stretched, like a dream you can't wake from. You tiptoe behind the lacquered doors of the Hall of Supreme Harmony, careful not to be caught eavesdropping on a woman who was once a concubine, then a nun, then a puppet, and finally the hand inside the puppet, moving everyone else. Her rise is as serpentine as a dragon drawn in ink full of coils, smoke, and sudden violence. Born in 624 into a wealthy, well-connected family, Wu Zha entered the court of Emperor Taizong at age 14 as a low-ranking concubine. Not a princess, not even a favored consort. Just another pretty face in a palace of hundreds. But even then, she stood out not just for her beauty, which was described in the florid language of the time as flowers in full bloom at midnight, but for her mind. She could read, write, compose poetry, and most dangerously observe. After Emperor Taizong's death, most of his concubines were sent to Buddhist convents, including Wu. You can almost hear the sandals scrape the cold stone as she shuffled through monastic halls, plotting not prayers but power. And then, like the world's boldest boomerang, she came back into the arms of the new emperor, Taizong's son, Gaozong. Oh yes, she returned not just to court, but to the bed of her former lover's son. A move so scandalous that even modern soap operas would take a pause. It gets weirder. Wu didn't just become empress, she allegedly cleared her path by eliminating rivals. The most disturbing accusation: that she smothered her own infant daughter and blamed the death on Emperor Gaozong's previous wife, Empress Wang. Historians still argue whether this was an actual crime or a slander campaign crafted by Confucian scholars who couldn't fathom a woman wielding imperial power. After all, records were often written by those with plenty of ink and even more resentment. You now walk beside her shadow as it glides past marble pillars. By 660, Emperor Gaozong's health had declined, and Wu was making decisions from behind a silk screen, an early version of shadow rule, but with far sharper hairpins. Once he died in 683, she made her move, bypassing the traditional regency and declaring herself Huangdi Emperor of China in 690. The world gasped. A woman on the dragon throne? That's like a cat declaring itself the landlord of a dog park. She founded the Zhou dynasty, briefly interrupting the mighty Tang, and began reshaping the empire to fit her image. She elevated Buddhism, commissioned massive works of literature, and even encouraged commoners to petition her directly. That's right, peasants could bypass corrupt ministers and send their pleas straight to the palace. Imagine your landlord asking for Yelp reviews in the 7th century. But don't let that fool you. Wu's benevolence had claws. She created a secret police force known for creative torture techniques. Not just whips and chains, rumors say suspects were sometimes interrogated with music so eerie it allegedly cracked the spirit like overripe fruit. One fringe account insists she had a bronze box built, where she could observe prisoners being psychologically tormented while sipping tea. That sounds wildly theatrical. Sure, but then again, this is a woman who once had 36 statues of her enemies made, just so she could decapitate them ceremonially. She was also ruthless with family. She exiled sons, executed in-laws, and trusted almost no one except her inner circle of eunuchs and favored scholars. Wu loved a good loyalty test. One official wrote that working under her felt like bathing in vinegar daily, stinging sour, but mandatory if you wanted to stay clean in her eyes. And yet, for all her brutality, Wu Zetian's reign brought real progress. She promoted capable officials based on merit rather than birth. She expanded the empire's reach and improved agriculture, trade, and education. A true paradox, swan-like on the surface, piranha underneath. One day she'd be composing a poem about lotus blossoms. The next, signing an execution order in the same graceful script. The Chinese court at the time was a place of calligraphy, conspiracies, and cloying perfume. And Wu floated through it all like smoke, intangible, shifting, impossible to pin down. Even her portraits are suspect. Most surviving images are either too flattering or too grotesque, depending on who painted them and what axe they had to grind. Near the end of her reign, aging and increasingly paranoid, she began to rely on two brothers, the John as the Zhang twins' pretty boys, basically who kept her company and maybe more. Officials despised them. Think of them as the Tang dynasty's version of ill-advised boyfriends with VIP palace access. When she finally fell ill in 705, a palace coup removed the twins, forced her to abdicate, and restored the Tang dynasty. She died soon after quietly in her bed. A soft ending for a woman who had been anything but. Today her tomb lies near Xixian. It's flanked by two massive stone horses and a blank tablet. That's right, her epitaph is empty. No inscription. No summary. Nothing. Historians still debate whether this was humility, erasure, or her own last joke on the record keepers who feared her so much. You step away from the marble steps now, your fingers brushing the edges of unseen history. Whether you believe she was a visionary leader or a calculating tyrant, Wu Zetian ruled with a kind of brilliance and madness that makes the line between the two blur like ink on wet silk. And if you feel a draft, that's probably just a ghostly whisper reminding you that history, like power, rarely plays fair with women. The scent hits you first, orange blossoms and sweet marzipan laced with something more metallic, more sinister. You've arrived at the French court in the 16th century, where candlelight flickers across marble walls and courtiers glide past in silk and velvet, whispering through jeweled masks. You're not just at a ball. You're inside a chess game with poisoned pieces, and Catherine de' Medici is seated at the center smiling, watching, calculating. They call her the Black Queen, the Italian witch, the serpent of the Valois court. But behind the gossip and shadow play is a woman with a death grip on survival. And she's not letting go. Born in 1519 in Florence, Catherine was a Medici, yes, those Medicis, the banking dynasty with enough power to make or break popes. But her early life wasn't a royal fairy tale. Orphaned as an infant, raised in convents, and treated like a political pawn, she was married off at 14 to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the future King Henry II of France. A girl in a foreign land, surrounded by enemies, and just to make things spicy, her new husband preferred his older mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Imagine being a teenager whose mother-in-law figure is your husband's lover, who also manages to look great on horseback and control court politics. You'd start plotting too. But Catherine played the long game. She observed, she waited, and she quietly gathered allies. When Henry died suddenly in a jousting accident, yes. A splintered lance through the eye, kind of sudden, Catherine emerged from the background like a shadow stepping into sunlight. She became regent for her sickly son, King Francis II, and when he died, for his brother Charles IX. France was fracturing from within, teetering between Catholic and Protestant factions, and Catherine knew her sons were too soft for a nation this sharp. So she became the power behind the throne, the one whispering in ears, orchestrating marriages, and choosing which nobles lived to see their next birthday. Historians still argue whether she was a peacekeeper or a puppet master. Some claim she tried desperately to keep France from tearing itself apart. Others believe she poured oil on every fire, just so she could play firefighter and arsonist at the same time. The scent hits you first: orange blossoms and sweet marzipan laced with something more metallic, more sinister. You've arrived at the French court in the 16th century, where candlelight flickers across marble walls and courtiers glide past in silk and velvet, whispering through jeweled masks. You're not just at a ball. You're inside a chess game with poisoned pieces, and Catherine de' Medici is seated at the center, smiling, watching, calculating. They call her the Black Queen, the Italian witch, the serpent of the Valois court. But behind the gossip and shadow play is a woman with a death grip on survival. And she's not letting go. Born in 1519 in Florence, Catherine was a Medici, yes, those Medicis, the banking dynasty with enough power to make or break popes. But her early life wasn't a royal fairy tale. Orphaned as an infant, raised in convents, and treated like a political pawn, she was married off at 14 to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the future King Henry II of France. A girl in a foreign land, surrounded by enemies, and just to make things spicy, her new husband preferred his older mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Bodies floated in the Seine. Church bells rang not for celebration but for slaughter. Historians still debate whether Catherine planned the massacre in advance, or simply lost control of a court she had kept on a knife's edge for too long. One account claims she stood on a balcony and watched the killing begin with a calm face. Another says she wept behind closed doors, knowing she'd unleashed something she could never call back. Her enemies painted her as a poisoner. Whether she actually used poison or simply understood that fear of poison was a power in itself, Catherine's name became synonymous with death by desert. Rumors swirled that she had a secret laboratory in the Louvre, where alchemists crafted perfumes laced with arsenic and gloves dusted with lethal powder. A popular legend insists she wore a ring that held a hidden needle, one prick and good night, forever. It's probably not true, but it makes for a deliciously gothic image, doesn't it? She was also obsessed with astrology. Her personal advisor was Nostradamus, the guy who's been wrongly credited with predicting everything from Hitler to the invention of toaster ovens. Catherine consulted him on everything: births, battles, coronations. She built an astrological observatory and planned court events around favorable stars. It wasn't just superstition, it was theater. A queen in a fracturing kingdom needed every edge she could get, even if that edge came from the movements of planets. By the time she died in 1589, France was still broken, her sons were all dead or dying, and the Valois line was sputtering into history. But Catherine had survived nearly every threat thrown her way: assassinations, wars, betrayal, plagues. Her legacy? As slippery as the polished floors of the Palais des Tuileries. Was she a manipulative schemer who bathed in blood and intrigue? Or a brilliant strategist trying to steer her nation through the worst century imaginable? You wander now through her empty halls, past the tapestries and the scent of dried herbs and fruit. The masquerade is long over, but her perfume lingers. Maybe Catherine de' Medici was both monster and mother. Maybe she was just a woman surrounded by wolves, who decided to grow fangs of her own. Either way, you wouldn't want to take a bite of anything she offered. You stumble now through thick jungle fog, warm and heavy like wet velvet, the trees curling around you as if they're listening. The vines drip with dew, and somewhere far off, a drumbeat pulses faintly through the underbrush, steady, like a heartbeat that doesn't quite feel human. Welcome to 19th century Madagascar, where superstition and sovereignty walk hand in hand, and Queen Ranavalona I rules not by charm or lineage, but by fear sharpened into ritual. The locals whisper her name like a spell, half in reverence, half in terror. And you're about to find out why. She wasn't born for the throne. In fact, she was born into the fringes. Her father, a commoner who warned King Andrian Poinimerina of a plot at his life, was rewarded by marrying into royalty. Young Ranavalona's fate changed overnight, but it wasn't until her husband, King Radama I, died in 1828 that she took her chance. The succession was murky, with male relatives circling like sharks, but Ranavalona moved fast. She secured the loyalty of the military and the nobles, and just to underline her point, had several potential rivals executed. Not exiled, executed. It sent a clear message: the Tiger Queen had claws. From the start, Ranavalona rejected European influence. Her late husband had welcomed foreign missionaries, diplomats, and technology, but she saw colonialism hiding behind those Bibles and trade goods. So she slammed the gates. Missionaries were expelled. Christianity was outlawed. Converts were rounded up and given a choice: renounce your faith or face a punishment called Tangina. Ah yes, Tangina. Here's where things get spicy. Tangina was a traditional Malagasy trial by ordeal. The accused would swallow a poison made from the Tangina nut, then eat 3 pieces of chicken skin. If they vomited up all 3, they were innocent. If they didn't or died trying, well, tough luck. It was like trial by fire, except instead of burning your hand, you were drinking slow, agonizing death with a chaser of poultry. Under Ranavalona's reign, tens of thousands are thought to have undergone this ordeal. Historians still argue whether this was spiritual law enforcement or state-sponsored purging. Either way, it's not exactly the justice system you'd hope for on your next jury duty. And yet, she wasn't mad. Not in the way that often gets lazily attributed to powerful women who rule harshly. Ranavalona was deliberate, strategic. She wanted to protect her culture, her kingdom, her authority. Western accounts called her barbaric and bloodthirsty, but they were also written by the same people trying to colonize her island. The fringe perspective: she might have been one of the most effective anti-imperialist rulers of her time, refusing to bend to European pressure when most of the continent was falling like dominoes. Her army was fierce and loyal, armed with muskets, and an unshakable belief in the sacred power of the monarchy. Her people saw her not just as a queen, but as a living conduit to the ancestors, a ruler with one foot in this world and one in the spirit realm. That belief was reinforced by strict rituals, taboo codes, and public spectacles of loyalty. Imagine marching barefoot for days just to perform a ceremonial dance in her honor, or face exile for skipping a step. The lines between faith, law, and fear were so blurred they might as well have been written in jungle mist. And then there were the cliffs. Rebels and dissenters, those who weren't burned, poisoned, or imprisoned, were sometimes hurled from the Palmyra cliffs near Antananarivo. Picture it: bound prisoners driven up a winding path, the capital city behind them, and the abyss ahead. The crowd hushed. Not with outrage, with awe. It was more than punishment, it was performance. A brutal ballet designed to remind everyone, your queen sees all, and she forgives little. Ranavalona also had a curious soft spot for architecture and innovation, at least when it came from within Madagascar. She oversaw the construction of a grand palace, the Manjakami Adana, which combined traditional design with modern touches like glass windows and multiple stories. And here's your quirky tidbit: one of her pet projects was a royal bathtub, imported from England, made of cast iron and weighing over 1,000 pounds. She never used it. It became more of a decorative curiosity, a metaphor, maybe, for how she treated all foreign imports. Interesting to look at. Useless to her reign. She ruled for 33 years. That's longer than most European monarchs of her era. And yes, The population may have dropped significantly during her time due to famine, disease, and those not-so-voluntary purges, but her grip never faltered. Foreign nations tried to interfere, missionaries tried to return, and internal plots brewed like storms, but she outmaneuvered them all. Every time. When she finally died in 1861, the kingdom exhaled. Her successor, her son Ranavalona I, reversed many of her policies, reopened relations with Europe, and attempted modernization. Within a few decades, Madagascar would fall under French colonial rule. Historians still debate, did Ranavalona's isolationist policies delay colonization, or did they weaken her people's ability to adapt when the world inevitably changed? But as you step through the imaginary dust of her palace and hear the echo of drums that never quite stop, one thing becomes clear: Ranavalona ruled like no other. She didn't smile to gain favor. She didn't play nice for the sake of diplomacy. She ruled for her people, her ancestors, her gods, and herself. Whether you call her a monster or a patriot depends entirely on which cliff you're standing on and which direction you're facing. Just try not to look down. You trudge through the icy mists of 10th century Eastern Europe, the bitter wind stinging your cheeks and the snow crunching beneath your boots. Welcome to Kyiv, the capital of the Kievan Rus, where a powerful queen rules with a fierce, almost icy determination. This is Queen Olga, a woman whose reputation for ruthless justice sends shivers down the spines of even the hardiest warriors, and that's just the beginning of her story. Olga wasn't born into power. She married Prince Igor of Kyiv, whose rule was as brutal as the winter, and whose fate was as grim as the coldest storm. When Igor was killed by the Drevlians, a neighboring tribe tired of paying tribute to Kyiv, Olga's world shattered. But instead of retreating into grief, she transformed. Legend has it that she swore vengeance so fierce it scorched the earth. And scorch it she did. Her revenge began with a seemingly polite gesture. She invited the Drevlians' emissaries to a feast, welcoming them as guests of honor. As they relaxed, enjoying the food and drink, the queen's men locked the doors and set the building ablaze. The emissaries perished in the flames, a fiery warning that no insult against her family would go unanswered. Talk about burning bridges. But Olga didn't stop there. When the Drevlians sent more envoys to negotiate, she killed them too, each time with a new brutal method. One story tells of her burying alive a group of noblemen, while another claims she massacred warriors during a funeral feast, turning celebration into carnage. Historians still argue whether these tales are exaggerated folklore or reflect the cold reality of her rule. Either way, Olga made it clear she was not a queen to cross. Yet beneath the iron and ice of her vengeance was a ruler with vision. She reorganized the tribute system to strengthen Kyiv's control over the tribes and improved its defenses, laying foundations that would help the Rus grow into a powerful state. She was also one of the first rulers in the region to convert to Christianity, a bold move that paved the way for the Christianization of the Kievan Rus decades later. Whether she did it out of genuine faith or political calculation remains a topic of scholarly debate. Here's a quirky twist. Olga reportedly once disguised herself as a man to spy on her enemies. Donning armor and a false beard, she infiltrated a rebellious tribe's camp, gathering intelligence that helped crush the uprising. It's a story that sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, but it's part of the enduring legend that surrounds her. Despite her ruthless methods, Olga was also known for her administrative skills and efforts to improve her people's lives. She built churches, reformed laws, and established diplomatic relations with powerful neighbors like the Byzantine Empire. Imagine a queen who could be both a merciless avenger and a savvy diplomat, all while living in a world where women's power was often dismissed. Her legacy is complex. To some, she is a fearsome warrior queen who avenged her husband's death with chilling efficiency. To others, she is a pioneer who laid the groundwork for a new era in Eastern Europe. And to historians, she remains a figure shrouded in mystery and legend, a woman whose life blurs the lines between fact and myth. So as you step back from the frozen courts of Kyiv, remember Queen Olga, not just as a figure of wrath, but as a woman who reshaped her world one fiery act at a time. You find yourself in late 15th century Spain, the sun setting over the dusty plains of Castile, painting the sky with blood-orange hues that feel oddly fitting for this tale. Queen Isabella stands at the center of this world, a woman whose iron will and devout faith shaped the destiny of continents, and whose reign mixed ambition with a hint of menace that still ripples through history. Isabella wasn't your typical queen. She rose to power amid political chaos, securing her throne through strategic marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon, uniting two powerful kingdoms and setting the stage for Spain's emergence as a global empire. But don't let the royal portraits fool you. Beneath that serene gaze lurked a mind as sharp as a dagger. One of her most famous decisions was funding a little-known Genoese explorer named Christopher Columbus. Imagine pitching an idea for a westward voyage to a queen who ruled with both practicality and superstition. Isabella agreed, gambling that a new route to the Indies could bring unimaginable wealth and glory. Spoiler alert, she got much more than that. But here's where the story darkens. While the promise of new lands shimmered on the horizon, Isabella's reign was also marked by a ruthless crackdown on religious nonconformity. In 1478, she and Ferdinand established a Spanish Inquisition, an institution designed to root out heresy and enforce Catholic orthodoxy. And enforce it they did with torture chambers, public trials, and the ominous silence of fear settling over towns. You might be surprised to learn that the Inquisition wasn't just about religious zealotry. It was also a political tool, used to consolidate power and expel entire populations deemed threatening to the unity of Spain. Jews and Muslims were forced to convert, flee, or face grim consequences. The infamous Alhambra Decree of 1492 expelled the Jews, sending shockwaves across Europe. Historians still argue whether Isabella's policies were motivated primarily by religious fervor or political expediency, or some complicated mix of both. Now for the quirky tidbit, Isabella was a surprisingly hands-on queen when it came to her wardrobe. She reportedly owned hundreds of dresses, each meticulously detailed, and she used fashion as a symbol of her power and piety. Imagine a ruler who could command armies and declare edicts, yet fussed over lace and embroidery, as if preparing for a divine coronation every day. Her piety was genuine, and her devotion to the Catholic Church was a defining feature of her reign. She funded missions, built churches, and made pilgrimages, balancing faith and ferocity like a tightrope walker. Yet, for all her devotion, her reign is often remembered for its darker legacies: the forced conversions, the burning of heretics, and the birth of an empire stained with conquest and cruelty. Still, it's impossible to separate Isabella's travel ambitions from her terrifying religious zeal. One moment she's dispatching Columbus across uncharted oceans, chasing dreams of gold and glory. The next, she's tightening the noose on anyone who dares stray from her vision of a united, Catholic Spain. So as you settle into this twilight world of ambition and faith, remember Queen Isabella as a ruler who reshaped the globe and rewrote the rules of power with all the contradictions that come with it. You creep quietly down the shadowy halls of a Byzantine palace, where flickering candlelight casts long, twisting shadows on mosaic walls. The scent of beeswax mingles with the faint, sweet aroma of incense, but don't let the calm fool you. Power in Byzantium is a serpent coiled tightly around the heart, and Queen Irene is its venomous strike. Irene of Athens wasn't your average empress. When her husband, Emperor Leo IV, died in 780, their son Constantine VI was still a boy. Irene stepped in as regent, ruling in his name. But as Constantine grew, tensions mounted between mother and son like a family drama, but with the stakes set on an empire's throne and the future of Eastern Christendom. The power struggle escalated until, in 797, Irene pulled a move so ruthless it echoed through the centuries. She had her own son captured and brutally blinded to end his reign. Blinding was a Byzantine favorite when it came to disqualifying rivals. Imagine a medieval "you can't sit with us," but far more permanent. Constantine's blinding was so severe that he died shortly after. With her son gone, Irene crowned herself empress, the first woman to do so alone in Byzantine history. But why such cruelty? Well, Irene wasn't just a power-hungry mum. She saw herself as the rightful ruler and guardian of orthodoxy in a fractious empire struggling with religious disputes, notably the iconoclast controversy whether religious images should be destroyed or venerated. Historians still argue whether her harsh actions were driven by ruthless ambition or a belief that her reign was essential for the empire's survival. By the way, here's a quirky nugget. Irene reportedly had a pet lion kept in the palace. This fierce feline roamed the imperial gardens, symbolizing her strength and authority. Imagine a lion prowling those mosaic corridors while palace intrigue buzzed around you. It's like Game of Thrones, Byzantine edition. Irene's reign was marked by both brutality and brilliance. She restored the veneration of icons, healing religious rifts and cementing her legacy as a defender of the faith. She negotiated treaties with the Franks, and even managed to secure a marriage alliance with Charlemagne, though the Pope famously rejected her imperial title, unwilling to acknowledge a female emperor. Despite her achievements, Irene's story is shadowed by that crimson wedding, her son's blinding. It's a reminder that in the Game of Thrones, especially Byzantine thrones, family ties are often the first casualties. Power wasn't just inherited, it was seized, sharpened, and defended with a cold, unyielding hand. So as you step away from those flickering halls, remember Irene not just as a mother, but as a queen whose grip on power was as fierce and unforgiving as the empire she ruled. You find yourself in a dark and foggy Transylvanian night, the chill biting through your cloak as you approach a looming castle perched atop a hill. Inside, whispers swirl like smoke tales of a noblewoman with a sinister reputation that has haunted history for centuries. Queen Elizabeth Bathory, the so-called Blood Countess, is a figure shrouded in mystery, terror, and debate. Born into one of Hungary's most powerful families in the late 16th century, Elizabeth was a wealthy, intelligent, and fiercely independent woman. But her legacy is stained by legends darker than the Transylvanian forests at midnight. The most infamous claim, she bathed in the blood of virgins, believing it would preserve her youth and beauty. A macabre image, sure, but historians still argue whether this gruesome tale is fact, fiction, or a smear campaign by political rivals eager to seize her vast estates. The official story comes from testimonies collected during her trial in 1611, which described her as a merciless serial killer, torturing and murdering dozens, perhaps hundreds of young women. The evidence, though chilling, is clouded by the era's political intrigues and Elizabeth's powerful enemies. Some scholars suggest she was a scapegoat in a ruthless power play, a victim of jealous nobles eager to bring down a formidable woman. But let's not ignore the bizarre. During the investigation, guards reportedly found secret torture chambers in her castle, filled with cruel devices and horrific scenes. It's enough to give anyone nightmares or at least inspire a chilling horror movie. Elizabeth's cruelty, whether exaggerated or real, fit the mold of a cruel queen, but there was more complexity beneath the surface. She was an influential landowner and a shrewd manager of her estates, and she used her power to protect her family's interests during a turbulent time in Hungarian history. Balancing authority and scandal is never easy, especially when you're a woman in a man's world. She was never formally tried or convicted. Her noble status spared her the death penalty. Instead, she was confined to her castle, where she spent the last years of her life imprisoned in a small room. Some say she died bitter and alone. Others whisper she maintained her innocence to the end. One quirky tidbit: Elizabeth was a fan of herbal remedies and cosmetics, rumored to experiment with strange potions and concoctions. Maybe it was these eccentric habits, rather than blood baths, that sparked rumors. Or maybe the truth is forever lost in the mists of time. As you step away from the darkened castle, remember Queen Elizabeth Bathory as a figure who might have been villain, or victim, a shadow queen whose true story remains tangled in mystery and myth, forever cloaked in crimson. You wander into the misty hills of northeastern India, where dense forests whisper secrets of ancient spirits and forgotten battles. Here lived Rani Gaidinliu, a fierce queen whose story blends the sacred and the rebellious into a potent brew of resistance and divine justice. Born in 1915 among the Ziliangrong Naga tribes of Manipur, Gaidinliu was a spiritual prodigy, believed to be chosen by the ancestral goddess Haipu Jidanan to lead her people out of the shadow of British colonial rule. By the tender age of 13, she had become a symbol of shamanic authority and political defiance, rallying tribes with a mix of sacred rituals and fiery speeches. Her rebellion was anything but conventional. Rather than wielding swords alone, Gaidinliu called upon the power of her tribe's spiritual traditions, blending religion and resistance into a seamless force. She led guerrilla attacks against the British while performing sacred rites, her very presence a living challenge to colonial domination. Historians still argue how much of her influence stemmed from her spiritual authority versus her political leadership, but either way, she was a force to reckon with. One of the quirkiest facts about Rani Gaidinliu is that she reportedly possessed the power to control wild animals, at least in local legends. Stories tell of her calming fierce tigers and summoning birds to deliver messages, blending natural mysticism with guerrilla tactics in a way that sounds like a tribal superhero origin story. The British didn't take kindly to this sacred rebellion. Yet even in captivity, her legend only grew, inspiring future generations to fight for India's independence. Unlike many queens who ruled by bloodline or conquest, Rani Gaidinliu's power came from her unique mix of spiritual leadership and political activism. After India gained independence in 1947, she continued advocating for her people's rights, receiving national recognition, but never losing her fierce commitment to tribal identity and freedom. Her story challenges the typical narrative of queenship. Her crown was spiritual, her throne was the jungle, and her kingdom was one of resistance and hope. So as you settle into the quiet hum of the night, remember the tiger lily of Manipur, whose fierce devotion blurred the lines between divine fury and the fight for freedom. You tread softly through the grand marble halls of 18th century Portugal, where golden chandeliers shimmer overhead and velvet drapes mute the sounds of distant prayers. Queen Maria I, known as Maria the Pious or Maria the Mad, reigns here, a monarch whose story is a tangled dance between devout faith and creeping madness. Maria ascended the throne in 1777, inheriting a vast empire that stretched across continents, from Brazil's lush jungles to the bustling streets of Lisbon. She was beloved for her deep religiosity and her sincere devotion to the Catholic Church, attending Mass daily with unwavering reverence. Yet behind the chapels and coronation gowns shadows gathered. Her reign was marked by tragedy. After suffering the death of her beloved husband, King Pedro III, and later the loss of her eldest son, Maria began exhibiting signs of severe mental illness. Contemporary accounts describe episodes of depression, paranoia, and religious mania that deepened over time, casting a veil of uncertainty over her ability to govern. Whispers followed her into the chapel. Some claimed her bouts of fervent prayer were moments of genuine religious ecstasy, while others suspected these were symptoms of a mind unraveling under the crushing weight of grief and duty. Historians still argue whether Maria's madness was purely psychological or possibly triggered by physical illness like melancholia or bipolar disorder. One quirky and rather touching detail: Maria was known to carry around a small stuffed dog named Saint, which she treated as her constant companion and confidant. In the midst of court intrigue and growing instability, this little dog was a symbol of comfort amid chaos. As her mental health deteriorated, power slipped from her grasp. By 1792, her son João, the future João VI, was appointed Prince Regent, effectively ruling in her stead. Yet Maria lived on as queen in name only, confined within the gilded cage of the royal palace, where her bouts of madness alternated with lucid moments steeped in prayer. Her reign coincided with a turbulent period in Portuguese history, the effects of the Napoleonic Wars, colonial unrest in Brazil, and political upheaval at home. Even as her mind faltered, her empire faced storms that demanded strength she could no longer fully muster. So, as you listen to the faint echoes of hymns floating through the chapel's high arches, remember Queen Maria I, the queen whose piety was both her shield and her prison, and whose descent into madness remains one of history's most poignant royal tragedies. You stand on the sun-scorched sands of the Syrian desert, where the ancient city of Palmyra rises like a shimmering mirage. In this oasis of marble columns and lush gardens, Queen Zenobia rules, a woman whose story is woven from silk and steel, grace and grit, daring and defiance. Zenobia was no ordinary queen. In the 3rd century AD, as the mighty Roman Empire grappled with crises and fractures, she seized the moment to carve out her own realm. Palmyra, once a prosperous trading hub bridging east and west, became the heart of a burgeoning empire under her command. She styled herself as a ruler equal to Rome's emperors, challenging the supremacy of the city that had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries. Picture this, a queen clad in gold-trimmed armor, riding into battle with a sharp mind as lethal as her sword. Zenobia was reputed not just for her beauty but for her extraordinary intellect and strategic acumen. She spoke several languages, including Greek, Latin, and Aramaic, and surrounded herself with scholars, poets, and philosophers. It's said she boasted a stiletto wit that cut through even the most boastful Roman senator's arguments. Her rebellion wasn't just military, it was cultural. Zenobia sought to revive Palmyra's glory, blending Greco-Roman traditions with the local Semitic heritage. She claimed descent from Cleopatra and Dido, invoking ancient queens who had also challenged Rome's dominion. Historians still argue whether Zenobia's revolt was an act of patriotic defense or outright ambition to seize imperial power. Her forces swept through Egypt, parts of Asia Minor, and much of the Levant, creating a short-lived but dazzling empire. But of course Rome wouldn't take this lightly. Emperor Aurelian marched against her, eventually capturing Palmyra in 273 AD. Legend tells that when Zenobia was captured, she was so proud that she refused to bow to the Roman general and was paraded through Rome in golden chains, though some accounts suggest she was later treated with respect and possibly even lived comfortably in exile. The truth is murky, but the image of a queen who defied the greatest empire of her time remains iconic. Here's a fun detail. Zenobia was said to have had a pet leopard, symbolizing both her fierce independence and exotic appeal. Imagine that, ruling an empire with a wild cat by your side, stalking the palace halls. So as the desert winds whisper through the ancient ruins, remember Queen Zenobia, the desert empress, who wielded sword and silk with equal mastery, daring to defy Rome itself with poise, power, and a razor-sharp mind. You step quietly into the labyrinthine corridors of the Forbidden City, where red lacquered walls gleam beneath the golden roofs, and the weight of centuries presses down like the humid Beijing air. Here, behind silk screens and guarded whispers, moves Empress Dowager Cixi, known by her enemies as the daughter of the devil, and by history as one of China's most controversial rulers. Born as Yanara in 1835, Cixi entered the Forbidden City as a lowly concubine, but she swiftly rose through the ranks, dazzling the emperor with her intelligence and charm. When Emperor Xianfeng died in 1861, leaving behind a young son, Cixi seized power as regent, effectively ruling the Qing dynasty from behind a veil of silk and secrecy for nearly 5 decades. Her rule was a delicate dance of fan-wielding subtlety and ruthless political maneuvering. She outlived and outwitted rivals, many of whom met mysterious ends. Historians still argue how far Cixi's hand reached in the deaths of court officials and members of the imperial family. Some say her icy stare could freeze the life out of any dissent, while others suspect the blood on her hands is more metaphorical, a testament to her unforgiving political savvy. Though she initially championed conservative Confucian values, Cixi had a surprising flair for modernization. Under her watch, the Qing court embraced railways, telegraphs, and even the beginnings of industrialization, trying to pull China into the modern world amid internal rebellion and foreign pressure. Yet, her resistance to deeper reforms contributed to the eventual collapse of the dynasty, a paradox that still puzzles scholars. One strange and intriguing fact: Cixi had a secret penchant for Western opera and fashion, often dressing in luxurious gowns with embroidered dragons while listening to European music, quite the contrast to her public image as the rigid traditionalist. She reportedly even smoked opium, a habit that some claim contributed to her declining health. Her political legacy is a tangled web. To some, she was a dragon queen, fiercely protective of her empire and family. To others, she was a manipulative usurper, whose iron grip delayed China's path to modernization and sowed seeds of revolution. As the heavy silk curtains flutter in the forbidden city's still air, remember Empress Dowager Cixi not just as a shadowy figure wielding a fan, but as a woman who shaped the fate of an empire, leaving behind a trail of intrigue and power, veiled in both silk and blood. You stand beneath the sweltering sun of 17th century Central Africa, where dense forests meet the sparkling waters of the Kwanza River. Here reigns Njinga Mande, known to history as the Black Queen, a fierce warrior, cunning diplomat, and master strategist whose story echoes with the clash of cultures and the grind of colonial ambition. Born into the royal family of Ndongo in what is now Angola, Njinga ascended to power during a time when Portuguese colonizers sought to expand their control through brutal warfare and deceit. But Njinga wasn't your average monarch. She wielded power with a blend of fearlessness and shrewd political savvy that would make even the craftiest European diplomat raise an eyebrow. Her throne was, quite literally, built on the backs of her enemies. She was known to display the skulls of fallen foes as a grim reminder of her yielding resolve. But Njinga was far more than a warrior queen. She was also a master of diplomacy, using negotiations and shifting alliances to keep the Portuguese off balance. Historians still argue whether her primary motivation was to protect her people or to seize power for herself, but either way, her influence was undeniable. One quirky and vivid detail: Njinga was famous for her flamboyant court, where she would appear dressed as a male warrior, complete with spear and shield, to command respect in a male-dominated world. She defied gender norms, blending the roles of king and queen, warrior and diplomat with effortless flair. Her reign included long campaigns of guerrilla warfare, fierce resistance against slave raids, and alliances with neighboring kingdoms. At times she converted to Christianity strategically, some say to gain Portuguese favor, only to later reject the faith when it suited her political aims. Njinga's life was a relentless struggle against colonial forces, but also an assertion of African sovereignty and identity. She remains a symbol of resistance and resilience, a queen whose iron will shape the destiny of her people amid the chaotic tides of empire and invasion. So, as the sun sets over the dense jungle and riverbanks, remember Queen Njinga, the Black Queen, whose throne rested on defiance, diplomacy, and a dash of theatrical bravado that even the Portuguese couldn't quite predict. You creep through the shadowy corridors of 6th century Neustria, a turbulent corner of what would one day be France, where whispers of poison and betrayal drift like fog in the cold night air. Queen Fredegund rules here, a woman whose reputation is soaked in blood, dark deeds, and the kind of intrigue that makes modern true crime podcasts seem downright tame. Fredegund started life far from royalty, but through a mix of marriage, cunning, and ruthlessness, she became queen consort to King Chilperic I. Their marriage was as fiery as the legends that would follow her name. Historians describe her as both beautiful and terrifying, a queen who wielded power with deadly precision. And yes, she might have dabbled in necromancy, or at least her enemies claimed so, using rumors to explain the horrific violence that seemed to trail her. Her life was a non-stop soap opera of midnight murders, political assassinations, and horrifying plots that included the poisoning of rivals and, reportedly, the the murder of babies. She fought fiercely to secure the throne for her son, often resorting to savage measures that earned her the nickname the most bloodthirsty woman in the Merovingian dynasty. Yet some scholars argue whether these accounts were exaggerated by rival factions eager to tarnish her legacy, a classic case of history, written by the survivors. One of the quirkiest stories involves her alleged use of a poison called venom of the serpent, a deadly concoction rumored to cause agonizing death. Some say she had her enemies secretly administered the poison, slipping it into their wine during royal banquets. Talk about dining with danger. Fredegund's reign was marked by brutal rivalry with Queen Brunhilde, a feud that spanned decades and involved entire armies and shifting alliances. Their bitter conflict shaped the politics of the Frankish kingdoms and arguably laid the groundwork for the eventual rise of the Carolingians. Despite her grim reputation, Fredegund was also a shrewd political operator who understood the brutal realities of her time. She survived assassination attempts, navigated the treacherous waters of royal court intrigue, and held power in an era when queens were often pawns rather players. So, as you let the shadows lengthen and the night deepen, remember Queen Crimson, the Queen of Neustria, whose life was a relentless battle of blood, poison, and power that still captivates dark imaginations today. You find yourself in the golden heart of Constantinople, where marble fountains trickle softly amid fragrant gardens, and the walls echo centuries of imperial splendor. Here reigns Theodora, the Byzantine empress whose story begins in the humblest, most scandalous of places and rises to the dizzying heights of power and revenge. Once a humble actress and courtesan, Theodora's early life was marked by hardship and poverty. Yet, unlike many who might have been crushed by such beginnings, she used her intelligence, charisma, and an iron will to rewrite her fate. Marrying Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century, she became not only his wife but his co-ruler, an unusual and formidable position for a woman in a deeply patriarchal society. Theodora's influence on the empire was profound. When the Nika riots erupted, one of the most violent uprisings in Byzantine history, just imagine the scene. Constantinople aflame, the streets awash with chaos, and the emperor ready to flee. But Theodora stood firm, reportedly declaring that she would rather die an empress than live in exile. Her steely resolve turned the tide, convincing Justinian to crush the rebellion with brutal efficiency. Historians still argue whether her reputed ruthlessness was political necessity or personal vengeance, but no one doubts her courage and cunning. She was known for using her position to advance women's rights, instituting laws against forced prostitution and protecting divorced women and orphans, while simultaneously maintaining a court as ruthless as any king's. One intriguing and less-known fact: Theodora reportedly introduced some of the earliest recorded uses of perfume in the imperial court, blending scents that became a signature of her reign, a subtle reminder that beneath her fierce political persona lay a woman who understood the power of allure and image. Her reign was a blend of silk and steel, justice and vengeance, mercy and terror. Theodora's story is a testament to the transformative power of resilience and ambition, how a woman once cast aside by society seized the throne and ruled an empire with molten rage wrapped in silken robes. As the sun sets behind the domes of Hagia Sophia, let the image of Queen Theodora linger, the sex worker, turned empress who refused to be defined by her past, and whose legacy still shines like Byzantine gold.